So Nintendo recently released their E3 Direct video for 2021, and although most people's eyes were peeled for information about Breath of the Wild 2, there was another announcement that drew a lot of attention. A new original 2D Metroid game for the Switch called Metroid Dread. This new project shares its name with an unreleased DS title that the Metroid team worked on back in the mid to late 2000s. It also clearly has a much greater focus on stealth gameplay and horror themes than its 2017 predecessor, Samus Returns. Naturally, many Metroid fans were ecstatic about this announcement, and lots of them rushed out to make YouTube videos telling the world just how excited they were. Now you might think that I, being a complete stick in the mud about Samus Returns, would have dismissed this game out of hand. But actually, my initial impressions were very positive. Stealth gameplay hasn't been very common in Metroid games, but it's a perfect match for the franchise's tone and atmosphere. Metroid Dread seems to be heavily based on Metroid Fusion, which is great. Fusion is possibly the most creative 2D Metroid game ever made, and following in its footsteps is a smart move. If Samus Returns was Mercury Steam struggling to find its footing with the complicated and easy-to-mess-up feel of classic Metroid, this sophomore effort is a chance to show off what they've learned. Samus running away from invincible, homicidal robots looks a lot more like what Metroid should be than Samus wrestling giant aliens to the ground and tap-dancing on their torsos. And while the trailer didn't show a lot of details, what was there suggested a generally darker tone and more oppressive atmosphere than Samus Returns. For the first time in a decade, I was actually looking forward to something in the Metroid franchise. And then I made a big mistake. I decided to read the game's official website, which goes into more detail about its premise and story. I'll sum up what I learned briefly. One day, the Galactic Federation gets an anonymous message from a deserted planet suggesting that the X Parasites, the DNA-copying antagonists of Metroid Fusion, are still alive. Concerned, the Federation dispatches a team of DNA-analyzing robots to the planet to track them down, but loses contact with the robots almost immediately. With no other options, the Federation sends Samus, the only human being immune to the X Parasites, to the planet so that she can figure out what's going on. Maybe this doesn't seem so bad to you. Samus being called in to salvage a botched GF mission has been done before. It's the premise of Metroid Prime 3, and elements of it exist in Prime 2 and Other M. But that doesn't make it bad. And 2D Metroid games aren't focused on story anyway, right? That's just an excuse to get Samus on a new planet to explore, right? So what's the problem? The problem is that this game is basing itself on the one 2D Metroid game that did have a major story focus, Metroid Fusion. And more than that, the premise of this game is a disrespectful retcon of the ending of Metroid Fusion that leaves an awful taste in my mouth. I am dreading the things that Metroid Dread might do to this franchise, and here's why. Metroid Dread's premise is a major retcon of the ending of Metroid Fusion, in which the Biologic Space Laboratory's research station was sent crashing into the surface of planet SR-388, causing a massive explosion that destroyed the only two places in the universe that hosted the X Parasites. Metroid Fusion's ending was not merely a literal end to the threat of the X Parasites, but also a symbolic end to a huge chapter of Samus's life. SR-388 was also the Metroid's home planet, and the place where Samus encountered the infant Metroid, which played such a crucial role in the stories of Super Metroid and Other M. Ironically, Samus's destruction of the Metroids led to the emergence of a potentially greater threat to galactic peace, and was only by using the preserved DNA of the last Metroid that Samus ultimately gained the strength to triumph over the X. Metroid Fusion gave us a Samus who seemed vulnerable and introspective, characterized Metroids as less an abomination of science and more a natural part of the environment, and presented the Galactic Federation in a much darker and more critical light than any previous game in the series. In many ways, it flipped the conventional approach to Metroid on its head. It was a bold experiment that made fans think about the universe in a way they never had before. And the fact that Metroid Dread retcons its ending in order to keep the X Parasites around completely deflates the dramatic punch of Metroid Fusion. Fusion's story completely revolved around the X and their intimidating presence. Samus spends most of her inner monologue musing over the fearsome adaptability and single-minded aggression displayed by the Parasites. Having to think of a way to eliminate them is what reawakens Adam's humanity and brings him and Samus together after their falling out near the end of the game. And when Adam reveals that the SAX, a parasite who copied Samus at her full power and has nearly killed her several times, is as capable of multiplying itself as any other X, so that by the end of the game there are half a dozen of them running around the station, the player is made aware of just how terrifying these creatures could be if let loose on an unsuspecting planet. Then, right at the end of the game, one of the SAX shows what seems to be an unexpected streak of humanity, when it fends off an Omega Metroid and then allows itself to be absorbed so that Samus can regain her full strength. It's only after Samus has chosen to utterly destroy the X, and dismissed them as soulless automata, that one chooses to sacrifice its life to save her. This is strikingly evocative of the ending of Super Metroid, where another supposed killing machine, the infant Metroid, protects Samus at the cost of its own life. In both endings, the tone is sorrowful and elegiac. These creatures are the last survivors of their species, and they're destroyed at the very moment that they gain the player's sympathy for the first time. After all this drama, bringing back the X is a plot point that carries some serious problems with it. First, the nobility of the SAX's self-sacrifice is much less moving when you know that some of the X end up surviving anyway. It raises questions that the development team probably doesn't want to answer, such as, did the SAX know that some of its kind would survive the explosion? Was this less a heartfelt act of kindness and more of a long con to get on Samus's good side before betraying her later? What does this mean for the Metroids, who really were wiped out for good when the BSL Metroid breeding project was destroyed? Or is that going to be retconned as well, so we can have Metroids in this game? Even assuming that the SAX really did sacrifice itself to save Samus's life, we have another problem. Now that Samus knows that X Parasites are capable of finer feelings, what is she going to do with that information? Throughout Metroid Fusion, Samus absorbed every parasite she saw without a second thought. Can she still do that to something that she now knows has intelligence? Maybe even a soul? Maybe the intentions of the development team are to explore that question in Metroid Dread, but it's a little difficult to tackle the question of whether or not blasting aliens is right in a game where the gameplay is blasting aliens. It doesn't seem to me that the X are being presented here as a complex foe requiring a nuanced approach. They seem more like the mindless scourge depicted at the beginning of Metroid Fusion, in which case the game is undoing a plot point that the developers of Fusion worked pretty hard to set up. Metroid Fusion's story has a sense of finality to it that places it at the very end of the Metroid timeline. By the time it's over, there are no more Metroids, no more X Parasites, no more space pirates. Not just the X, but basically every major antagonist that Samus has fought over the years is gone, and Samus has been changed by her experiences, both mentally and physically. There's a constant theme throughout the game of species going extinct when the last of their kind is absorbed and killed by the X. Ceres, the space pirates, the frozen corpse of Ridley, and by the end even the X themselves, meaning that even the genetic copies of all these creatures are gone forever. Both dramatically and in terms of atmosphere, Metroid Fusion is the end of the line. But not anymore. Now Metroid Dread is the end of the line. Even though its basic premise, the revival of a supposedly extinct threat, suggests continuation and rebirth, not the end of a story. Really, if the X can come back after such a serious blow, there's no reason that any antagonist in the series should be considered gone forever. Phazon was supposed to have disappeared from the universe when Phase blew up at the end of Metroid Prime 3. But why not invent some backwater planet where a bit of it stuck around to cause new problems? Why not bring back Dark Samus, Kraid, Mother Brain, Psylux, that creeper from Mother M, and of course Ridley for the god knows how manyth time? The problem with retconning a major plot point in any franchise is that it's difficult to know where to stop. Maybe reintroducing the X won't automatically ruin Dread's story, but think of the bad precedent it sets, not just for future Metroid games, but even the later parts of Dread itself. In my experience, lazy writing begets more lazy writing. But beyond the problems that reintroducing the X causes for the franchise's continuity, there's another serious problem with retreading the story and tone of Metroid Fusion. Nintendo's already done it before. We haven't received a lot of details about the levels and structure of Metroid Dread yet, but if it resembles Metroid Fusion in any respect other than the story, which is quite likely to happen, it's going to run into another serious issue. Other M already copied Fusion first. Both Fusion and Other M take place on a large research vessel split into thematic units like the water area, the fire area, etc. Both games have a recurring shape-shifting antagonist, in Fusion's case, the X, and in Other M's, the species that Ridley belongs to, which goes through several different evolutionary forms over the course of the game. The two games are also darker in tone than other Metroid outings, portraying the Galactic Federation as a secretive, morally questionable organization that seeks control of the galaxy by any means necessary. Both games involve a collaboration between Samus and her former commanding officer Adam Malkovich, and both feature a fight against the Nightmare, which makes it pretty ridiculous that Samus doesn't recognize it in Fusion, but whatever. As far as continuity is concerned, we've got bigger fish to fry. Does Metroid Dread have to redo any of these details for the third time? No, but it's hard to believe it won't include at least some of them. The game takes place on a deserted planet, so the themed research lab angle is probably out, although it could be shoehorned in, and Mercury Steam did something similar to SR388 in Samus Returns. Since the X are back, their presence as a prominent threat is pretty likely, which means shape-shifting enemies and bosses. As for the darker tone, that's virtually guaranteed. The game is called Metroid Dread, for Christ's sake. It's up in the air whether the GF will be portrayed as morally questionable, but since the biggest advertised draw of this game is fighting rogue GF-designed robots, yeah, there's a decent chance. Will Samus be commanded by Adam Malkovich? It's hard to see why she wouldn't, given that she reconnected with him at the end of the game that this is the sequel to. It would be more difficult for them to contrive a reason for him not to be here than to keep him in, unless Samus is doing this mission completely without GF oversight. Unlikely, given that it's a reconnaissance mission and they want her to maintain contact with them. And the Nightmare? It would be pretty rich to bring him back after 2 solid thrashings in previous outings, but consider this. First, now that the X Parasites aren't really dead, there's no reason why one with his DNA couldn't be kicking around somewhere. And second, Mercury Steam has already included a forced fan-service-y boss fight with a popular recurring character in one of their games. Given their track record, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the Nightmare grace our screens with his gross, lumpy presence once again. Metroid Dread is being widely hailed as the first really creative and interesting Metroid project in a long time, yet from the premise alone it seems set to be a reboot of familiar ideas. Other M was similar, and it was a flop with the fans, but it wasn't really for that reason. Other M's divisive nature had a lot more to do with its action-focused combat and awkward, tone-deaf plot progression, not so much the fact that it wasn't innovative in the story department. It's disturbing to think that a story just as derivative as Other M could be a hit with the Metroid fanbase as long as it's accompanied by the right kind of gameplay. But from where I'm standing, it looks like that's exactly what's about to happen. Obviously, I don't want Metroid Dread to fail, either financially or artistically, and despite everything I've said, this game could really be great. There are plenty of developers who started their careers with a few underwhelming and formulaic games, and then really knocked it out of the park with something special. The one that comes to mind right off the bat is Way Forward, with the Shantae games and Sigma Star Saga. While I think the story is starting off with one leg tied behind its back, there's no question that the tone and atmosphere of this game are already intriguing, and promise a lot more than we got from Samus Returns. This is also an original story, which gives Mercury Steam some leeway in the storytelling department that they didn't have with Samus Returns, which had to have a pretty simple story because of its by-the-numbers structure. If anything, my goal with this video is just to move people's feelings about this game away from rabidly optimistic and closer to cautiously optimistic. This is no time to despair over the game, but it's also not time yet to pat Nintendo on the back and congratulate them for a game that's not even close to finished. Enthusiasm for a franchise can be a wonderful thing, but too much enthusiasm convinces the company that owns the franchise that fans will go wild over anything they put out, and in the long run that makes them lazy and uncreative. Don't let that happen to a franchise you love and respect. You want your franchise to be the best that ever was, and not the one that's pretty good, all things considered, as long as you ignore the bad parts. Don't you?